So we made sure that every template has a section, asks questions of the teams filling it in to make sure that the patient perspective is fully integrated.
Hi, I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Clarinda, and this is Not Just Patients,
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thank you for tuning in. Our guest today is Bronwyn Lewis, who is the Global Head of Patient Engagement at Boehringer Ingelheim, and she is here to talk about patient engagement from the industry perspective.
Bronwyn has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for more than 20 years in roles spanning sales, marketing, market access, training, strategy, and operations. Bronwyn joined Boehringer Ingelheim in 2013. Originally from Canada, her and her family relocated to Germany and the Boehringer headquarters in 2017. And in 2021, she took the role of Global Head of Patient Engagement. Thank you so much for joining us, Bronwyn.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored.
So just to start with, I was wondering, from an industry perspective, how would you define patient engagement? And could you tell us a little bit about why pharma should be engaging with patients?
Well, we define patient engagement as the two-way, bi-directional experience of working with people living with disease to understand their needs and priorities and preferences better, which helps us to then also make treatments that bring more value to them in the end. It's absolutely critical that we do this. And when I think about other industries, if we think about consumer goods like shoes, running shoes, would we ever make products and not ask people using those products what they want and then ask them in the design process to help us to make it better for them? And yet that concept, when it applies to the pharmaceutical industry, I think has been behind what we've seen in other consumer areas where we create products.
It seems like the obvious thing to do. So why do you think pharma is so late to the party in involving people the products are meant for?
Yeah, it's something I've reflected on as well. I think the first answer that comes to my mind is around a highly regulated industry, which means it's that much more complex to engage with people outside of the development process. So I think that's one reason. And I also wonder if there's an aspect of expertise in terms of good scientific principles where there has been an assumption in the past that people living with disease don't have the expertise that's required to have an informed conversation. And that's a whole topic I think we can go into, right, around the growing expertise of patients and patient experts to be part of the process and an equal stakeholder at the table, which is why I think intellectual humility is so important in areas like this, where scientists and drug developers tend to have a huge degree of expertise, but that doesn't mean that it's not important to understand the experience of people with the disease that they are designing treatments for.
Yeah, and it speaks to the fact that I think you can study a disease either as a doctor or you can look at the papers, but you'll never fully truly understand what it's like to live and experience a disease unless you speak to someone who has it, or speak to, let's not forget, caregivers as well, who have to help those people live their lives. And I think that's such a powerful way to think about it. By living with it every single day, you are inherently an expert in that disease. You might not be an expert in the science, although I think a lot of people learn, especially in rare disease. You might not be able to make a drug, but you do have the experience that no one else could possibly have if they don't live with that disease.
Exactly. And how can you possibly design a great solution or treatment if you don't understand the problem?
Absolutely. So switching tracks, Bronwyn, could you tell us your own story and how you came to be involved in patient engagement?
Sure. When I joined Boehringer in 2013 in Canada, I was responsible for developing the strategy in a new disease area called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And at the time, I was a one-person team, if you want, and I knew right at the beginning that I needed to engage and connect with the community, so patient organizations that were supporting this rare condition. And there was actually just one in Canada called the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. And this was a patient organization founded by Robert Davidson, a person living with IPF. And at the time, he had had the disease for about a decade, if I'm remembering correctly. And he had had a few years before I met him a double lung transplant. And as we started to compare our objectives, talk about what his priorities were for his organization and what
Mhm.
the priorities were in Boehringer's case in terms of IPF. And we found so much commonality
Mhm.
in what we both wanted to do, started to work together. And it was building the relationship with him and understanding his experience that just sparked my conviction that it's so important to work with people living with disease and people representing others who live with disease in order to make the whole process better. And I'll never forget a story that he told me before he had his double lung transplant. When he was on oxygen, and really his quality of life was suffering in the sense that he was so breathless, and just his activities of daily living, his day-to-day tasks were so challenging. Getting up, getting showered, eating. We don't even think about eating and breathing at the same time unless we struggle with that, right? And he described setting chairs up every 10 feet in the hallway to get to the bathroom.
Mhm.
And he would go from the living room and would plan for half an hour to reach the restroom.
Mm.
And then it would take half an hour for him to come back. Imagine the process of going to the restroom taking, an hour and planning,
Mhm.
and every 10 feet he would stop and rest in a chair.
Mhm.
If you don't understand that, and yet you're trying to develop treatments and solutions that improve the experience of someone living with that condition, you can't even begin to fathom what would be meaningful for them. So it was that interaction with him that really sparked my interest. And then when the opportunity came up a few years ago to lead the patient engagement team at the corporate office, I jumped at it.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's such a powerful story. And while you describe your specific role and the role of your team, I'd also love to understand how you brought your team on board with this concept. Was it an intrinsic passion that they shared, or was there structured learning?
So if we zoom out a little tiny bit, just to preface by saying that Boehringer Ingelheim is a family-owned company,
Mhm.
which really is embedded in our culture and our way of working as well. It's 140 years or so old, so lots of history there. About 53,000 employees, and just to set the stage for the organization that we support. I was privileged when I came into the role to have about 5 people on the team already who were patient advocacy relations managers and had deep expertise themselves already in engaging with patient organizations and patient partners. And in fact, at Boehringer, work has been done in terms of patient advocacy for decades now. So I was lucky to start working with a group of people who already had deep expertise. And they taught me as well, because I've never been a patient advocacy relations manager. So I need to learn from them first, right?
Mhm.
Or together we could develop our strategy for how we wanted to really bring value as a team. As a global patient engagement team, we're about 20 people, and we have a couple of distinct roles in the team. One group focuses on advocacy relations with patient organizations, et cetera. There's another group that are, let's say, more internally focused, and they're the point of contact for all of our internal teams. We also have a center of excellence, and they focus on contracting, governance within the organization, supporting our engagement with patient partners through logistics and planning. And they actually are the glue that help us get a lot of the work done as well. And together, what we focus on are 3 main strategic priorities. The first one is strengthening our partnerships.
Mhm.
And then the second key priority that we have is to systematically integrate the patient perspective in our whole drug development process. We ask ourselves with any decision, what is the patient perspective? Have we received input that helps to inform our decision-making process here? And if the answer is no, then we need to go back to the drawing board
Mhm.
and actually listen and then act on it. And then our third key priority is around fostering our culture as a patient-centric company. We're lucky as well in that we have a few guiding principles for the organization. And one of them is called patient centricity. And that guiding principle is for everyone in the organization, all 53,000 people. And it urges employees to create value for patients by understanding their needs and their priorities and focusing on those all the way through your work. And it's something that my team actively works to enable. And that could be through training, through making it easier for functions and teams to engage directly or to learn from what we've heard from our patient partners. That's the one that keeps me up at night, actually, because it's a lot easier to set the strategy and work on what we're going to achieve together in a team of about 20 people at the corporate level than it is to enable some 50,000 people to do it.
Right.
So culture is critical,
Yeah.
and yet also, I think, the most nebulous, let's say.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It's really cool that a company like Boehringer Ingelheim have that function in place to ensure what sounds like really meaningful patient engagement. I want to ask you a question that might sound quite cynical, but I'm asking because I know that there's this feeling generally sometimes in the patient engagement community about the way that pharma engage with patients. Generally, having these patient engagement teams within pharma seems to be a fairly recent development. And I think with regards to the specific role of patient advocacy or patient engagement lead, it tends to be people who have come through pharma, not necessarily with a patient engagement role or experience. They've just got a senior role and then moved into advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's whether I think it could, I'm not saying it is for you, but whether it could be seen as sort of a little bit of a tick box, oh, we have a patient advocacy role or a patient advocacy team. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, is that something that is really meaningful for pharma? Is it something that you think, speaking about the industry in general, is something that will stick around, maybe evolve a bit more, become more meaningful?
Such a good topic. You're right. And in fact, I think I'm an example of that because I have a commercial background, which sometimes I wonder if people judge me about, because now I'm in this role and I have a commercial background. I started off in sales. What do I bring from those experiences? A deep understanding of the clinician side, having worked with general practitioners and specialists across many therapeutic areas, many diseases, a deep understanding of their role in the experience that patients have. But what it also brings me is an understanding of the industry that we're in and the very complex and complicated process of manufacturing medicine. And that is one expertise that is needed in a team, even a patient engagement or patient advocacy team. We need to understand the drug development process in order to know how we can bring value to that in a differentiated and unique way. Having said that, I've got multiple people on my team who come from patient advocacy background. So I think it's finding that balance of people who have firsthand experience in patient advocacy as a starter in their career, as well as people who have deep experience of the pharmaceutical industry drug development process. And between those two unique but complementary perspectives, you have the skills and expertise needed to help the rest of the organization do what they need to do.
That's a really interesting model and definitely valuable for both the soft and the hard aspects of the role, I think. From what I'm hearing, there is scope nowadays for pharma to employ patient advocates as employees. Again, a potentially controversial question, but do you think that that might create a conflict of interest for patient groups who tend to do this for a very noble purpose and the perception of pharma doing this commercially? And to be clear, both Caitlin and I pro pharma. I mean, we work with pharma closely and we know that as patients, we would not have any of our health objectives met in the absence of pharma. And we understand all the background work and struggles, honestly, that go into drug development. But yeah, I was just wondering how those two ideals, I guess, come to a point of agreement and how that's perceived.
I guess the reality is that in order to do research, you have to fund it. And that is in the ballpark of billions of dollars to bring a drug from a concept to being approved. And hence, the most common model is a for-profit model because you need to fund that research, and so much effort would be spent fundraising if there wasn't, that element there. I guess I don't think of it personally as an us versus them.
Mhm.
I think we can achieve more by instead saying, what can we do together versus what do I do that's more important or less important than what you do next door.
Right.
So for me, it's not a conflict. Although I can appreciate why for some people it might be.
Yeah, and I think maybe a little part of that just comes from potentially a bit of a misunderstanding of what pharma does with that money.
Mhm.
Not in the patient community specifically, but in the general lay public, there's this big bad pharma piece where it's pushing drugs for millions of pounds. But actually, if you think about that, as you said, as research costing billions, and if a pharmaceutical company does not profit from selling that drug, then they can't go on to make more. And I've certainly personally experienced it, that a massive breakthrough has been made in my disease area, and I now have access to a treatment that has changed my life, and it cost a lot of money. But if they didn't charge a lot of money, then that company couldn't have gone on to make treatments for other rare diseases. So I think it's about saying, that the goal is the same, just to get really good treatments to patients to improve their lives.
Yeah, and I can only speak for what we do at our organization, but last year we reinvested 21% of our net sales in R&D. So this is more than $5 billion into that research just in 1 year. Especially to do it quickly and to do it well, it takes a lot of resources, both in terms of people and of course investment, to fund those trials, etc. So I can see all sides of the argument, if you will.
So we've spoken a lot about why patient engagement is important and how it's evolved to become a bit more intrinsic to what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry. But what are some of the challenges involved in forming those collaborative partnerships between pharma companies and patients, caregivers, patient organizations?
So one, I think, is around compensation and fair recognition for expertise. I don't see it as any different that, we should recognize the value of someone's time, whether they're a patient expert or whether they're a scientific expert, an external key opinion leader, for example, a clinician. In some countries, there still is not local governance or guidance or guidelines around how to properly and compliantly compensate people for their time and their expertise, which really gets in the way of partnering and also inhibits, in terms of our objectives, to also include diverse perspectives. Some of the things that I look to in terms of fair remuneration are tools. For example, PFMD, I'm a board member of Patient Focused Medicines Development as well. And PFMD has a great fair market value guidance to ensure that we can engage and compensate people for their time. And related to that is contracting and payment terms. What makes sense for a business to business interaction is not the same as what makes sense for a business to individual or patient organization interaction. So for example, payment terms of 60 days or 90 days, or say requirements of submitting invoices for certain types of activities for which some individual patients or even smaller organizations might not have their infrastructure in their organization to do that. And sometimes there can be rigidity in a big company like Boehringer to doing it a different way. And that's our job as well, through our Center of Excellence, to keep pushing the envelope and say, we need to find a better way to do it that also works for the people that we're engaging with.
You mentioned earlier that regulatory challenges are one of the big reasons that, even these interactions have been so late to begin with. So how does that play out now? Is it more an open environment in terms of regulations?
Yeah, I think, we were lucky to have had experience over time in finding ways how to do this better. And I think back to, the late 2000s, where patient advocacy was already in place in our US organization. And then about 2010 is when it was established at the global level. So that's 15 years ago now. And so, 15 years of experience of finding ways to compliantly engage helps. And I think the resources that we have available now in terms of external guidance, as I mentioned, through patient-focused medicines development, et cetera, even the FDA guidances that they started issuing in 2020 have paved the way for working together in a compliant way and in a way that results in better treatments in the end. So I think it's a constellation of events that has enabled better collaboration, and not to say that we can't continue to improve it.
Yeah, it's lovely to see that we've made some headway in addressing some of those challenges. I'd like to move on now and touch upon a topic that you recently covered in the Reuters event, which is ROI, which I believe can be quite a beast in pharma.
Ah,
I'm sure that internally it's potentially very difficult to measure the impact of some of these interactions. Just as an example, the story that you told about your former patient colleague, and the difficulty he has just getting to the bathroom. While there are so many intangible insights there that you're incorporating every day into your work, there's really no way to make a one-to-one correlation to say that this conversation led to this. And do you see that as an impediment in having to justify ROI internally?
my instinct on this is that with the patient engagement function in the industry being relatively nascent versus other very longstanding, well-established functions, I think that begs from some organizations the question around how do we know that this function, this team, is delivering, the impact that we expect or want to see from other functions. And then I'm going to sidebar and say I feel privileged to work for a privately owned company who works and plans in generations versus quarterly investor cycles. So I think the experience I have in that environment is really different from somebody who might be working at an organization that is publicly traded and really driven by investor cycles. But I really think this is not even a topic we need to discuss anymore, given that regulators have been very clear. And I know the FDA is leading the way, but the European Medicines Agency is not far behind. The Japanese Medicines Agency, PMDA, has issued patient and public interaction guidance as well. So they're coming along too. I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see really structured ways and purposes for engaging from regulators, and the expectation that we prove that not only the safety and the efficacy of the treatments that we're developing, but why they matter to patients. And that we demonstrate that we've incorporated patient preferences and priorities into our clinical trial design, into our endpoint design. And if we don't do that, I don't think we're going to have, good outcomes from the regulator perspective. So, back to your question, this is more this bigger picture that I see, but I think one way that we can demonstrate is through activities, which are, let's say, leading indicators. What we really want to get to is the outcomes, the impact. And that's, Clarinda, where you started, right? Which is harder to demonstrate. But if we look specifically at patient experience data, where we can clearly demonstrate how patient experience data informed trial and drug design, and that the benefit of the treatment is beyond safety and efficacy and really addresses how patients feel and function, that becomes a lot clearer to justify. So I think that path or area of generating purposeful patient experience data, which then is included as part of our submissions to regulators and health technology assessors, will really legitimize this work.
Yeah, and I think those requirements from the regulators are actually really, really welcome, not only just by the patient community of saying, right now you have to include us, but also probably, Bronwyn, for people like you or people in pharma who say, okay, now we have to do this. No one can push back and say, we don't have the time or the resource. It's something that you can say, no, actually, we need to do this in order to get our drug approved and reimbursed. And speaking a little bit to including the patient experience, I think while that is now required and is something that you can use to demonstrate the return on investment, something that's quite difficult, I think, still is how do we measure that in a way that is meaningful for the regulators and for the HTA? Because I know that they do use quality of life measures in clinical trials, but the quality of life measures maybe aren't fit for purpose for every single disease.
Yeah.
And I think that's where maybe there's still a little bit more work to be done in terms of how can we truly measure the impact of a drug or an intervention on a patient.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I mean, there's many types of patient experience data and methods used to generate that. And patient reported outcomes being one type of clinical outcome assessment that's conducted. That area of expertise alone is one that we need to keep building the muscle around to ensure that we're first of all measuring what's important to patients, that the tool we're using to measure it with is validated and accepted by the regulators. And then, the results that we get out of it are contextualized by patient experience so that we know that the results are meaningful in terms of the improvement. So there's all kinds of important elements just to that one type of patient experience data alone that we need to make sure we get right in order to have it be an acceptable measure and one that means something to patients as well.
I think that's an interesting point you made about the patient engagement functions being relatively nascent. And I think that it's just a matter of time before concrete metrics get integrated into your processes, and capturing real world data or patient experience data is a great way to start. I'd like to move from broader patient engagement to being a little more specific. Could you tell us all the different ways in which pharma is looking to engage with patients?
That's a big question. And I'll speak just from my experience currently, because I'm sure there's other ways that other companies are using as well, which I'd love to learn from too. But it really is multifactorial, let's say. One of the ways in which we can engage with patients or patient communities is through patient organizations. And we often do that by working together, partnering around surveys, as an example, to capture an understanding of the current disease experience. We also do a lot of work with patients using different methods to understand their experience. So one-on-one interviews with patients and their caregivers and their families, which help us to build a qualitative understanding of what they're experiencing. And then another way we work is through the clinical trial process as well. And that engagement, of course, comes through the clinical trial sites with whom we work very closely to try to optimize the experience that participants in clinical trials have while they're in the trial and even afterwards. And that's a really critical type of engagement in the sense that, not only do we want that quality of experience to be good, but we also want the quality of the data that they contribute to be good so that we can ensure that that provides decision makers like regulators and health technology assessors with the best level of evidence that we can generate. We do focus groups, advisory boards, and in that kind of method or setting, we try to work with a diverse representation of patient perspectives. So from both underrepresented subpopulations within a disease to different country geographic representation. And those advisory boards and focus groups can be tackling all kinds of topics from materials that we're developing to support either people living with the disease itself or to help people who are taking treatments to help give them the information they need to take the treatment effectively. Or we could be talking in advisory board settings specific to, clinical trial design, et cetera. We also have a source around understanding the real world experience of disease, whether that's through registries, and those registries can be held by patient organizations, they can be held by academic hospitals, mining that real world data to understand the actual use and experience with treatments and within a healthcare system. So there's so many ways that we engage either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and quite clear as well. And one of the things that I was thinking as you were speaking is the patients who you interact with to get interviews or part of advisory boards or anything. I think it's quite clear to me that if you go to a patient group or through a specialist centre, you can find the patients that way. But if you're an independent patient, not affiliated necessarily to a patient organisation, how do you find those people?
I mean, I think of the UPATI matching program, right? Groups like UPATI or even FMD are trying to connect people who have questions with people who have answers. So there's those kinds of opportunities from non-competitive coalitions or organizations that can help to connect us. I think there's also an aspect of patient empowerment that starts to filter into this, in the sense that, people are findable. So I've had people reach out to me on LinkedIn, as an example, which is a whole other governance conversation to have in an organization. How do we compliantly expand the channels for people to engage, right? So I think it goes in both directions. But what you've described, Caitlin, is the most sort of traditional way. And I'd love to brainstorm more. Maybe you've got other ideas in mind too, about how we can connect the people who have something to share with the people who want to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of the suggestions that you made there, and certainly the UParty Connect platform that's one of the reasons that exists. And just from an advocacy perspective, where we were talking about LinkedIn, I think Clarinda and I and a lot of other people we know, we're almost sort of building a brand and becoming influencers almost in a space, so that people become aware of us.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of work that the independent advocates looking to get involved need to do. I don't think it suffices to say, hey, I have all this expertise and no one's asking me for it. You can't just sit there and expect that to happen. It's a really big world, and there are more and more of us, but connectivity is easy, and it is possible to, put yourself out there and make a noise about the value that you can bring, I think.
And that's the definition in my mind of patient empowerment.
Right.
Individuals who are enabled to take control of their own health and their healthcare decisions, and to advocate for that.
Right.
And we know that when patients are empowered, their health outcomes are better. And this whole topic I'm really passionate about. Patient empowerment, in my mind, is this lever that we have not even tapped into in terms of a powerful opportunity for change in terms of our collective health outcomes, either as an individual or as countries or societies or communities. So I really admire the approach you're taking, because that is, in my mind, by definition, an empowered patient.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question to how you engage patients. So my understanding is that there's a whole lot of insights that are generated through all these interactions. And how do you pass those on through the organization? I know that this is a topic that among industry folks is talked about a lot, which is, translating patient insights and making them almost the currency that the organization operates in. Do you have systems and processes set up for that?
We did a thorough analysis a few years ago of all of our processes, templates, all of our important decision-making milestones. We actually ended up with 66 critical documents and time points in the development process where we felt it was critical to have patient insights and input included.
Wow.
Because these are the important decision points that really shape what a treatment looks like and the value it can bring. And to make sure that that information is included in those critical documents, strategic documents, and decisions, we baked it in. So we made sure that every template has a section, asks questions of the teams filling it in, to make sure that the patient perspective is fully integrated, and so that it becomes a must-do.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then there's also the official documents like SOPs, where if you bake it into the mandatory guidance, then we all have to comply with that. So that's kind of forcing it into the organization. And then when you have the guiding principle of patient centricity, that's the other side of the coin, and making it a push from individuals in the company versus a pull by the documentation required and that kind of thing.
I just want to reiterate for our listeners the fact that you identified 66 touch points in the R&D cycle where patients should be involved. And that's just so promising. I mean, for anyone out there who's listening and thinking that pharma doesn't care about patients or isn't really thinking about incorporating their perspective. I mean, I as a patient expert can probably think of 3 or 4 points in the journey where you might want to strategically involve patient perspectives, but this is
Mhm,
so cool that it's being integrated in such a holistic way.
mhm,
And this is why one of our key success factors is systematic integration. Because it's one thing to identify these critical decision points, but it's another thing to systematically do it across multiple therapeutic areas, across many, many, many teams. And that's the ongoing bulk of our work, is making sure that we're doing it the same way as much as possible in all areas of the work that we do. Maybe over time, that will become second nature and just reflex for everyone. And in the interim, we'll put all of the structure around it to make sure that it gets done. So
That's really interesting to hear from my perspective as well, as someone who works with the pharmaceutical industry. I feel like every time I see a project, I'm that little annoying voice in the background going, and what about the patients? And unfortunately, quite often the answer is this isn't for patients or about patients. And I would argue that every point along that journey should incorporate the patient perspective somehow, even if we're not directly engaging them. Where are those insights? How are we incorporating that in? And why can't we?
Mhm. And that shift from insights to action, what are you doing with that? How are you making a better or different decision
Mhm.
based on that information?
Yeah.
And then how are we able to document that we made a better decision, right?
Mhm.
To be able to learn from that and to be able to describe that as well when we're talking with other external stakeholders who want to know, and still something that we can get better at as well.
Yeah. Since you spoke with such lucidity about incorporating insights and bringing action, do you have any examples that come to mind from your own work of how a patient insight has been acted upon or thought about actively, and then it's led to some outcome that you can describe?
Some examples come to mind. We have goals around incorporating the patient perspective in our trial design outlines, how we design trials, right?
Mhm.
And this is going back a few years now, but this is specific to scleroderma, to systemic sclerosis. And in the process of partnering with patient organizations and people living with scleroderma, we heard from them that the way in which we were capturing the data was not comfortable. Let me give you a specific example. So
Mhm.
often in scleroderma, there's restrictions with the skin and tissue around the mouth, all over the body, loss of elasticity, etc. And the protocol for the trial that had been drafted had mouthpieces. They had to do lung function testing,
Mhm,
adult
mhm.
mouthpieces, because the people in the trial were adults, right? So that sounds logical, right? And yet, when we did trial simulations, we learned that it's really uncomfortable for people with loss of elasticity around the mouth to put their mouth around an adult-sized mouthpiece,
Mhm.
which resulted in the decision to use pediatric mouthpieces in the trial.
Right.
It's asking the questions in design of trials to understand how to make that experience better, which ultimately results in the quality of that experience of the participant, but also can lead to better results in terms of better participation in the trials,
Right.
because it's more comfortable, frankly.
Right.
We need to be doing this in every single trial.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great and very tangible example. Thanks.
So I think we'd like to move on a bit to hear a little bit about some of the patient engagement initiatives happening in Boehringer or wider in the industry, if you feel comfortable talking about that. We specifically as well wanted to ask you about the Global Patient Partnership Summit, if you'd like to start with that one.
Sure. This is something that we host every 2 years.
Mhm.
And the first summit was in 2021 during the pandemic. So it was all virtual. Thankfully, in 2023, we were able to come together in person and embrace this power of partnership together, and including over 270 participants, 168 of those who were patient partners. But we had 3 different locations around the world, one in Miami, one in Singapore, and one in Vienna. And the intent there was to really try to represent different geographies and have a diverse perspective. And there were 4 themes that we tackled together. And one was patient empowerment. The second was multiple diseases, so comorbidities. The third was integrated care, so the experience of the person in their system around them, wherever they live. And then the fourth was patient experience data. And across those four themes, we generated 52 solutions. And then we voted together for what we considered to be our top solutions. And those four themes were decided by a steering committee that was equal representation of patient partners as Boehringer employees. So all the way through, from the design of the summit to the facilitation of the summit to the actioning of the solutions that were generated, has been done in partnership, which is so exciting.
So cool.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it is. It's so inspiring. One of the key principles of the meeting was that we wanted to activate attendees to act on their own, to act together, whether that be across patient organizations or whether it be in collaboration with Boehringer. But we really wanted people to do something with it. And we've already seen initiatives that have come out of the GPPS in 23 that, have created tools or resources at a local level, which is really exciting. And just a few ahas that I can share. One was the realization that there's such power in bringing people together across diseases. And it's just so evident that while, of course, there's unique experience and attributes of any given disease, there's also a lot of commonalities across, right? We really didn't expect to see such sort of combustion of ideas. And yet, we'd hear of an organization in this country creating advocacy toolkits that was exactly the same as organization in another country, in another disease area. And you think, if only we could work together and either share resources and say, before you create something new, use this as a starting point. And I'm sure you're going to have to customize it for your disease area or your country, but start from this. And so that was one of the ahas that struck us and then led to the decision that one of the initiatives to come out of the GPPS was just to keep the community together in a couple of different ways. One is monthly calls that we have where we focus on different themes, or we have them share best practices. Maybe it's an initiative that they've run with in their country, and so they share back. And then the other, which took a long time to find a compliant way to do it, but to keep the group together real time through a messaging app, just so that in real time, someone can say, I've had a success or I have a problem, and let's see what comes out of it.
Yeah. So I think the reason that Caitlin and I are both nodding so vigorously is that in an earlier conversation with Tamash, we spoke so much about commonalities between disease areas and how there seems to be no collaboration across disease areas, but there could be huge benefits if that happens, and that there are actually a huge number of synergies that go unnoticed unless they start talking to each other. I think the other thing that makes sense to keep the community going, we've seen that after the UPATI patient expert program, Caitlin and I are both on a WhatsApp group with other fellow experts who graduated with us. And it's just so great to hear different people's successes or just ask a question related to patient engagement. And they're not answers that are easy to come by, but this small community does have some answers, and that's really powerful.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of key initiatives in addition to keeping the community together that have come out of GPPS 23. One of the resounding topics that we felt deserved a global approach was patient experience data. That was the theme where we felt we needed to work together the most to make progress, whereas you could argue that integrated care is very specific to a country. So we agreed to focus on patient experience data, and there's two initiatives that we're running with right now. One is around patient experience data capabilities, because the unmet need we heard from our patient organization partners was that they wanted to build their expertise to generate their own patient experience data or to act as consultants on other people's patient experience data. And then the other partner to this initiative is around patient experience data utility. So how do we improve the use of patient experience data, particularly in HTA interactions?
And did you have any other stakeholder representatives at the conference? And what are your thoughts potentially on other industry stakeholders attending, for example, or perhaps even a competitor doing a similar conference?
Yeah, there are many different types of initiatives like this that are led by industry as well. And to my knowledge, I don't know if we've done that yet. Collaborate across organizations, across industry partners.
Right,
In these summits, we really are focused on our patient organization partners.
right,
That's kind of where it started and where we continue to put the emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
It's through Patient Focused Medicines Development, which is a non-competitive coalition of cross stakeholders. So in that group, we have about equal representation, roughly 40% or so patient organization or patient partner, and about 40% industry. And then the other 20% are academia. We have some regulators who also observe. We're actively seeking HTA participation.
right.
But having this neutral coalition of PFMD is a great place to start to have those conversations.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to have meaningful medicines development and meaningful patient engagement, it really needs to be something that's streamlined across all stakeholders.
Yeah.
Regulators and health technology assessment do impact what pharma need to do with regards to patient engagement. So I think it's really cool to have that space where everyone can collaborate and speak to each other, and it's a multi-stakeholder environment.
Right.
And yes, it would be great if the industry as well could collaborate with each other. And I agree that then maybe it's difficult if one company is sponsoring an event. But
Yeah.
then, like you say, having an independent event, whether it's, the Reuters event or whether it's PFMD or whether you party run something, to bring everyone together in a room, no one's competing, it's just all trying to learn from each other and reach the same goal, then I think it's really beneficial because pharma can learn from each other as well.
Absolutely. Because
Right.
there's many types of patient experience data, like disease characterization, for example, that is not specific to a treatment.
Right.
We're just wanting to understand what is it like to live with this condition in real life with existing treatment options, say, out there in a health system. And all of that is non-competitive data. And yet each pharmaceutical company is generating it in a silo, in parallel. And the implication there is that the more emphasis we put on understanding the patient perspective, the more demand there will also be on patient organizations, patient partners, et cetera, to fuel that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is one topic where I think it's clear, and I keep advocating for this, that we could define non-competitive types of patient experience data and then start the conversation around how can we share this better.
Right.
So, and that needs to be a multi-stakeholder conversation.
Right. Bronwyn, I love that this idea comes from you, because I'm just thinking that coming from one of us, it just seems like we're idealists hoping that pharma can collaborate. I think you're representing the patient voice when you say that you wish that there was more collaboration like this.
This is one aspect to the future that I could see.
Yeah, you've touched on it very briefly there, but our next question to you was about what you expect in patient engagement, how you expect it to evolve in the next 5 years. And then a bit further on, what would be your long-term dream for the patient engagement space?
So one area that I envision in the next 5 years to have critical importance is around inclusion of diverse perspectives. There's just no question that historically people who have enrolled in clinical trials come from a small subsegment of the population of people living with that disease.
Yeah.
And that does not represent every subpopulation necessarily. And we need to be able to confidently answer that question, right? That treatments are equally safe and effective in all different subpopulations within a disease area. So I think increasing the number and diversity of patient partners that we engage with will be of utmost importance in the next 5 years. And certainly from an organizational perspective, we will continue to work on this aspect of systematic integration of the patient perspective and finding ways to enable the organization to be patient-centric, which is really a culture, it's a mindset, it's a way of working. And I also would like to see pioneering in terms of new ways and more effective and efficient ways to engage. But I think we can keep adding tools to the toolbox, if you want to use that analogy, of ways that we can compliantly work together and partner to ensure that we develop products and therapies that actually bring the most value that they're able to do. So enabling that process of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also lay language, huge opportunity. We
Yeah.
need to talk to people in a way that they can understand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know the drivers of patient empowerment are health literacy, digital literacy, et cetera. We can do a lot better there.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question in my mind. I'd be curious to hear what you think. When it comes to health literacy and data literacy, do you think you have to have both, or is there one that is more potentially powerful to inform and enable the average person to be more empowered? My instinct is that maybe it's digital and data literacy that will open the door to information that helps you become more health literate. And that if we focus in one place, maybe that's where we should focus to really move the needle. Because, you know, once you're online, you have access to materials from all over the world in any language, amazing resources like Chat GPT to help digest information to a level that you can understand.
Yeah, it's a strange, almost chicken and egg question, isn't it? Because
Right.
my instinct was actually the opposite of what you said, that health literacy maybe should come first, because my understanding of health literacy is kind of your ability to access and process and use health information to help make decisions. But you're right, a lot of that information is on the internet and is about data.
Yeah.
So I agree that digital literacy is something that's really important and just will continue to be more important. And on the data side, I suppose it's just the ability to be able to find reliable information and understand it, because there are thousands of resources out there and there's Chat GPT. How do I know which resources are reliable? How do I know which are correct? Because I think Chat GPT is amazing, but it's not always right.
Right.
So it's a minefield, I think, even if you are clued up to be able to spot what is reliable and what is not. And I think that's why patient organizations are so important. That's one of their key roles, right? They provide information that is digestible for patients and they put the stamp on it that says this is from a reliable source. But you have to empower people to go look.
So I do have a perspective on this from a geographical context. I live in Mumbai in India, and this health literacy versus digital literacy question is so important because when I think about rural India or even large parts of uneducated India, there is a very clear power disparity between a doctor and a patient, right? I mean, that exists everywhere in the world, but much more so in rural, developing, and perhaps illiterate conditions, where the patient literally just does not even think to question the doctor. Even in Mumbai, which is a metro and arguably one of the most developed areas in India, there are doctors that cater to a population that is happy to receive green and blue pills in a packet and they don't know what they are, but they just take them. But unlike other developing countries, the internet penetration in India is huge. I mean, it's massive. Every little village and town that does not necessarily have sanitation or toilets, people have mobile phones and the internet. And so the accessibility of digital medical information, or the idea that there can be campaigns and things like that that just go out to people where they are on YouTube, on their phones, that is sort of trying to lay this seed of progress in a direction that your health matters, you control the narrative around your health, or you get a say. That's where it would start, rather than being able to change the perception and tip that power scale more towards the patient side, I think.
Yeah, there's such power there. To add to what you both contributed, I did an interesting exercise last year with a number of our patient experts, consultants, to imagine what the future could look like for an empowered patient. We looked to global healthcare megatrends, and We looked to, position papers and consultancy papers that had been published and shared to try and glean which ones of these possible future trends apply to individuals living with disease, and what could we imagine that person in 10 years might look like. And a couple of the key themes that came out, you've just spoken to, Clarinda, being active in your healthcare decisions, which is why we think that people will be more likely to choose clinicians or institutions that either practice shared decision making or deliver information in a way that's understandable to them and involve them as a person living with disease in the decision making process. Similarly, we think that people will want and demand information that's relevant to them, and they'll filter for content and they'll become more savvy at identifying quality. I really admire, for example, the work that the Patient Information Forum does with their PIVTIC, right? To help label materials that have been reviewed for accuracy and balanced content. So yeah, people will want to understand their health status, and they'll want to own their healthcare data, and they'll want to be accepted for who they are. And they, of course, will want access to care that they need, and they'll want to live well with conditions that they have. So aiming for that person in the future is a really good grounding exercise for us, because it helps to stay focused on not only equipping the person of today, but being ready to help the person of tomorrow or 10 years from now to manage their health in a really proactive way. And, one opportunity when I think about the future as well, I love the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, which basically breaks down behavior change into really small action steps. And I keep thinking about how we could apply this concept to healthcare so that we can modify easily our way of day-to-day living and achieve our health goals more effectively.
Super. This has been so exciting and so invigorating, I think. Thank you, Bronwyn, for being here and for all these amazing perspectives that you've shared. Just to wrap up, could you just share a single piece of advice, if you had to just pick one, for industry stakeholders looking to engage more with patients and also for patients looking to work more closely with industry?
Happy to do that. From the perspective of patients and people living with disease who want to be able to share their experience, I would say just keep advocating to find the right channel to be able to do that. And in doing that, you set an example and you lead by your actions other people who may ask themselves, what do I have to share? And then from an industry perspective, there's building and growing expertise. And if your organization doesn't have that yet, tap into the resources that exist. Do the UPADI training. Look at all of the great tools that Patient-Focused Medicines has developed. Do your homework with the guidances that regulators are issuing. And then tap into your industry colleagues who are really committed to this, because we can learn from each other. And then for those industry partners who are actively doing this, we just need to keep asking ourselves, how can we do it better, more effectively, differently, with innovation to keep, moving us forward to where we want to get to together, which is improving patient care.
I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know we asked some difficult questions and touched on some controversial topics, so thanks so much for your willingness to chat with us. You've shared loads of really interesting thoughts and left us with some questions as well that I think we can discuss as a community and things to think about and move forward with together.
Thank you for having me.
So, Caitlin, what a great conversation, right? Do you want to tell me what some of your top takeaways were?
Yeah, it's been fantastic conversation, really enlightening. And I think the main thing that I've taken away from it is actually the amount of opportunities there are for pharma to engage with patients and vice versa. We've heard about so many different examples of activities today, and it seems like the full way along the medicine's development process, there are opportunities to engage with patients.
Right. And this actually reminds me of our earlier conversation with Tamash in an earlier episode, where he mentioned that we've been surprised by how easily the industry has adopted patient centricity. And I thought that it was very heartening to hear the same from Bronwyn with very concrete examples. And I think that patient advocacy groups have so many different focuses and areas of work and skills. And it seems like no matter where you are on that spectrum, there are opportunities to collaborate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things we discussed was maybe a little bit of skepticism about engaging with pharma because of the perceived goal or gender that they're just trying to make a commercial profit. Whereas actually, from what we've heard today, pharma are actually really trying to make innovations in care to make patients' lives better. And from a patient advocacy or patient organization perspective, that is the same goal, right?
Right.
So I think when we're on the same page with that, then it can allow for much more meaningful collaboration and ensure that both sides are really getting something from the engagement.
Right, right. And that's not to say that pharma will not continue to have commercial objectives, and there is a need for that. And speaking of commercial objectives, I think what she said about ROI fits and it makes a lot of sense, which is the fact that the function is so nascent means that all your metrics and measures are not necessarily set up, but they're going to get there because it's going to evolve. And when they do get there, there will be metrics and there will be more measurable ways. And in the meantime, just being able to show that patient experience data shows positive trends because of pharma innovation, that's enough for now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just to sum up, I guess this space is still evolving. There, of course, are still barriers that need to be overcome, and there are still changes that could be made to make patient engagement with the pharmaceutical industry easier and better. And we can all keep learning, but it is moving in the right direction. And there's an awful lot that can be done now that couldn't be done 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patients with our guest, Bronwyn Lewis, and your hosts, Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Sareja.